So last time we dipped our toes into some muck. And specifically, we talked about the muckrakers and how these journalists and academics and authors are becoming alarmed at, among other things, the plight of the urban poor in late 19th century America. These muckrakers are going to lead to the beginnings of the progressive movement, which we talked about last time. And specifically, we discussed how one work in particular, Jacob Riis's How the Other Half Lives, kind of gets people talking about the plight of the urban poor in cities. Well, things are going to get even muckier today. We're going to talk more about the progressive movement and how this movement is going to set the stage for some really dramatic and revolutionary changes. It also is going to create this kind of trifecta. That leads, by the way, to the emergence of the Democratic Party today. We sort of talked about that with the populist movement. But the thing to remember is that during this time period, you can kind of think of the Republican Party as the party of business and management, and the Democratic Party as being the party of kind of everybody else. And those political divisions between business and everybody else was even clear during Alexander Hamilton's time. So what we see with the advent of the progressive movement is the story of the final piece of the puzzle. That puzzle is what movement will lead to the most effective sort of pushback against the robber barons. We talked about the introduction of labor unions. We talked about the emergence of farmers in the Midwest. Now we're going to see mostly urban, educated intellectuals, people from old money, that kind of thing, also start to become more politically active. And speaking of which, by the way, we're going to talk about the S word. No, not that S word, but in American politics, it's, considered pretty dirty. And that is socialism. Was that I hear? Is that from you, America? Oh, yes, the argument that socialism is un-American and evil and it makes you a communist traitor. Well, okay, you don't have to love socialism. You don't have to hate socialism. You don't really have to have any opinion on socialism as far as I'm concerned. But I do want you to know what socialism is, because a lot of people believe that, remember, socialism and communism are basically interchangeable. That's dumb. I hate to say that, but I'm just going to level with you guys, because socialism and communism are two very, very different things. Okay, so a little discussion on definitions before we get to Mr. Handlebar Mustache over here. So remember that in a socialist society, the state has control of the means of production. So what that would mean is that the robber barons, for example, would be robber barons. They would be managers appointed by the state, by the government, in charge of factories, businesses, industries, that kind of thing. But they wouldn't have ownership of the thing they ran. The state would basically control the means of production, the things that produce wealth. Now, that being said, that's very different than communism, because the idea of communism is where the lower class rises up and overthrows the people who have property. And based upon the classical sort of definition of communism under Marx, the state is really controlled by members of those people who have stuff. The bourgeoisie. That's the simple definition. And so in Marx's view, what should happen is that in order to create a communist society, the lower classes, the working classes, also known as the proletariat, should rise up and basically overthrow the bourgeoisie and create a classless society. Now, the way that that's going to work, though, is that it means that the proletariat basically implements a dictatorship where only they are able to hold political power. This is called the dictatorship of the proletariat. Marx kind of argues that this is kind of a necessary stage in the pursuit of true perfect communism, which, according to Marx, is this, big sort of wonderful idyllic paradise in which people frolic in meadows and the people and the state are one and the same. And if this sounds trippy, that's because it kind of is. I should also hopefully not have to tell you guys that no communist society has been able to get to that point yet. The idea is that the dictatorship of the proletariat, this sort of autocratic government that is supervised by the workers, in every scenario we've seen that play out, communist societies never get beyond that point. And so what that means is that communist societies, not only do they believe that the state controls the means of production, they also believe that the working class controls all political power. So communism almost invariably is meant to give the working class, let's say, almost dictatorial or authoritarian political power. That's not what we're talking about with socialism, though. And that's, again, because it's one of those things that's discussed a lot today, it's important that we're clear on those definitions. So there are a lot of socialists in the United States during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And there's a perfectly rational explanation for that. No matter what your opinion is on socialism, at least the socialists seem to respond to some of the issues and problems raised by the emergence of the robber baron class. And this is kind of what sets the stage for Edward Bellamy's book, Looking Backwards. Bellamy can't really be considered a true muckraker because he was a novelist. But the thing is that the muckrakers kind of defied genre and medium. A lot of the muckrakers were novelists, playwrights, journalists, historians, sometimes a combination of all four of these things, believe it or not. So Bellamy was a middle-class New English author who was alarmed at the emergence of the robber barons and how much economic and political power that they wielded. And so he tried to describe some of those fears and anxieties in a book. It basically is kind of like a variation of the old story of Rip Van Winkle, except the hero is Julian West, who apparently falls asleep and wakes up 113 years later in the far distant and more enlightened future, the future of the year 2000. In other words, probably like the year or so before you were born, at least for most of you. So apparently, West discovers that the United States has evolved into a utopian society. And it's a utopian society in which basically all property, especially if you're looking at all let's say all the major industries, are nationalized. They're controlled by the state. So remember that whenever we discuss novels, we sometimes talk about novels because they are unique in some way. They sort of communicate an idea or a perspective that nobody has really, articulated before. But sometimes novels are just important because a heck of a lot of people read them. And to be honest, Bellamy's book is kind of important for both reasons at once, maybe. So if we think about the most widely read books of the late 19th century, in descending order, number one, believe it or not, is Ben-Hur. Number two is an old favorite, Uncle Tom's Cabin. And number three is Edward Bellamy's Looking Backwards. There were something like 160 book clubs that formed across the United States that were just meant to discuss some of Bellamy's ideas. And again, Bellamy's ideas involved the nationalization of most major industries, the formation of sort of industrial society, societies, labor unions. And interestingly, by the way, the president of the United States was supposed to be kind of the leader of these industrial societies. In fact, Bellamy refers to them as the industrial army. But by the way, even though I said that socialism and communism are different, and that communism tends to be much more politically authoritarian than socialism, at the same time, we do see undemocratic streaks in a lot of Bellamy's writing, where Bellamy is kind of cynical about democracy, partially because this is a time period in which corporations wielded a significant amount of control over politicians. And in Bellamy's mind, the best fix for this is to make politicians less accountable to the whims of the voters. And so the president of the United States, and looking backwards, is almost like this, I don't want to say dictatorial figure, but this figure who doesn't really get held accountable to anybody. And again, in looking backwards, the only people who can really vote are people who are of retirement age, let's say who are highly educated, who apparently can have the appropriate perspective. So, by the way, this also kind of suggests that even though Looking Backwards is a book that's responding to the complaints of ordinary people, it does kind of take an elitist view to a certain extent. And this is a friction throughout the progressive movement, where the progressives are mobilizing because of what ordinary people are experiencing. But the progressives themselves usually aren't ordinary. They're usually extremely well educated, and they're usually people who kind of argue that because of their education and experience, they should have more political power. And this has, been sort of a criticism of the progressives from this point. It's also important to understand, though, that the progressives as a group would not generally identify as being socialist. Generally, they might argue that maybe the robber barons and their trusts should be taxed more, that there should be government regulations put into place to rein in their power. But I would say, and it's hard to say for sure, by the way, but I would say that only a minority of progressives really did believe in nationalizing all private property. I mean, that's controversial today, let alone in the highly capitalist late 19th century. But it is an argument that gets people talking. So in American history, we do see characters like Edward Bellamy crop up occasionally from time to time. Political radicals who are trying to sort of move the goalposts of society in one direction or the other. You could argue that Thomas Paine was that person, right? But if you remember, Thomas Paine, even though Common Sense was widely read, wasn't entirely responsible for the development of the Revolutionary War and the movement that supported the Revolutionary War. Similarly, Edward Bellamy's Looking Backwards is an important piece of the puzzle, but it's not the only piece, because sometimes one of the ironies of history is that sometimes radical forces can lead to change, but also sometimes traditional forces can also lead to change. And in American history, the most powerful, I would argue, of all those traditional forces is religion. And again, especially for some of you sophomores, by the way, I hope you kind of remember that way back when there were the Puritans and the Pilgrims, and they were, religion to them was kind of a thing. And that this adherence to powerfully held beliefs like Calvinism led to them making some pretty revolutionary changes. So during the progressive era, we see what could arguably be called a third Great Awakening. This is a little less clear-cut than the first and second Great Awakenings. In fact, the third Great Awakening as a concept is something that historians debate. But what we do see is we see religious a religious reaction to the emergence of the robber barons and the plight of the poor in big cities. One thing that's kind of interesting is that before this outpouring of religiosity that we sort of associate with the social gospel movement, is that American Christianity and arguably Christian churches all over the world have to respond to a very specific challenge, and that is the challenge posed by Charles Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection. And for those of you who don't know, remember that evolution by natural selection basically posits that life evolves over time through a series of genetic adaptations, which eventually results in the development of new species. If you have any further questions about this, please ask your biology teacher, who can probably explain this as much better than I can. Miss Ferguson, I'm sorry for inflicting this punishment upon you. But the fact is that the theory of evolution does kind of pose a challenge for many Christian churches, especially those Christian churches who sort of hold to the belief that humankind was uniquely created by God in the image of God. But you would expect that this is where you would see the mushroom clouds. This is where you would see a lot of fighting and controversy, and there is some fighting and controversy. But what's really interesting to me is that you will see that, but it's in the 1920s, not so much in the 1860s, 70s, and 80s. If anything, what kind of happens is that churches kind of shift their efforts from doctrine and theology and more towards being active. And one of the things that maybe connects, if there is such a thing called the Third Great Awakening, with other awakenings, is the emphasis on action above all cost. And this is where that social gospel movement comes in. So this is interestingly where, just like in the Second Great Awakening, churches become very political, and they also have a strong social welfare message. So the American Protestant minister Charles Sheldon develops the slogan WWJD. Now, when I was a wee lad, I saw these bracelets were kind of commonplace, and the WWJD slogan is basically an acronym for "What would Jesus do?" And basically, the way it was used when I was growing up is that it was used as a way to kind of get people to be reflective about their actions and whether they were right or wrong. So WWJD. Well, Jesus would probably not punch somebody in the face. So, Billy, or 3 a.m., don't punch somebody in the face. That's bad. Believe it or not, that slogan wasn't really meant to be so general. That slogan was really meant by Sheldon to get Americans to focus on the plight of the poor. Charles Sheldon was an American Protestant minister, but he was also a socialist. And one of the things that might kind of surprise us is that, nowadays, many people sort of have the idea that Christianity and religion in general and socialism are somehow incompatible. And that's arguably more the case in the 20th century for reasons that we'll hopefully talk about later. But it's not as much the case in the 19th century. And so you see a lot of religiously based welfare organizations that emerge in the city. There are two religiously based organizations that begin in the UK, specifically in London, but eventually cross over the pond to the United States. The Salvation Army, this, probably I don't know this for sure, but one of, if not the most well-known sort of charitable organization in the United States, begins as an outgrowth of the Methodist Church in the UK, and eventually is used to help in poverty relief efforts in the big cities in the United States. The YMCA, the Young Men's Christian Association, and the YWCA, the Young Women's Christian Association. These were also British organizations that developed to serve as basically, you can almost kind of think of them as places for people moving in from the countryside to live on a short-term basis. Actually, the Y, interestingly, is really not meant to be kind of like this place where you go to work out or swim. The idea is that for people moving from the countryside into the city, they need a place to stay, and the cities. There's this idea that cities can kind of be corrupting influences, right? Cities are unwholesome. There's a lot of bad things you can do in cities. There are bars. There are tons of ways to get into trouble. And the idea is that you create these houses in which people would bunk together, and you would emphasize Christian virtues, simple living, and wholesomeness. But these social gospel reform efforts were dedicated to relieving poverty, and some Protestant ministers were very explicit on this point. You had Walter Rauschenbusch, it's a great name, who says that the goal is to create the kingdom of God on earth. And interestingly, we hear some of the same slogans during the Second Great Awakening. If you remember that during the Second Great Awakening, the goal was to establish the kingdom of God on earth at that point, except that eventually it's decided that the way to do that is to destroy evils like slavery. Now, what's happening, arguably, to a lesser extent, admittedly, is that some of that same energy is being shifted towards the fight against poverty and those who have been left behind, the capitalist revolution. Just like in the Second Great Awakening, in the social gospel movement and in the progressive movement in general, women play an outsized role. And in fact, you could kind of argue that in many cases, women are the drivers of progressive reform in a number of different ways. And so we actually have to jump back to last semester, where we left off with the fact that women try to basically get the right to vote with the 15th Amendment. There's a debate, but ultimately nothing comes of it. Suffragettes challenge the 15th Amendment in court and basically argue that the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment allows for women to have the right to vote since they too are American citizens. And remember, the Supreme Court just dismisses that case entirely. So women are sort of left in the lurch, but after 1865, the movement for female suffrage resumes, which, remember, it had basically been paused following the end of the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. So what happens is you have, remember, you have two suffrage organizations, ASA and the NWSA, and eventually they merge together and form the NASA organization. And what's happening is they are slowly but surely going out and making appeals at the state level and trying to get the right to vote based upon state law. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. But what's fascinating about the women's rights movement of the late 19th century is how, on the one hand, it seems like it's a very radical movement, at least for the time, but at the same time, it also seems a very traditional movement. So we have the Women's Christian Temperance Union that forms in 1873, and remember that they are, fighting against temperance, against prohibition, and that's based upon the old cult of domesticity, right? The idea that women are supposed to basically maintain the household and be sort of the spiritual center of life in the house. So That's all true. At least that idea, that a concept is powerful during the 19th century. But what's really interesting is that if you look at the founder of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, Frances Willard, you see like this very interesting background. On the one hand, she is somebody who is fighting against the consumption of alcohol, but at the same time, she campaigns for women's rights. She is a Christian socialist, by the way, and like many progressive reformers, she was trying to gain government recognition of an 8-hour workday. So we see some elements where she's pushing for progressive reform, but at the same time, we also see her sort of, campaigning on issues and sort of speaking on issues that would have appealed to women who were more traditionally minded. So just like everything that involves women's rights, we see kind of a mix here. We see really radical movers and ideas, and we also see very traditional movers and ideas sort of form the center of this movement. When we say that women don't have the right to vote, though, we need to be clear by what that means. It's not the case that women across the United States absolutely could not vote. What is the case, though, is that in some states, women could vote, and in some states, they couldn't. The issue is that, remember, going all the way back to the 18th century, states basically got to establish their own voting laws. And the only laws that really changed that dynamic is the passage of Amendments 14 and 15, right? But other than that, states can basically establish their own voting laws. So what that means is that, interestingly, in some states, women absolutely did have the right to vote. And here's what's really interesting. You would assume that some of the first states to adopt female suffrage would be states like, Massachusetts or New York. But that's not what happened. So interestingly, the very first state that basically adopts full suffrage for women is the state of Wyoming in 1869. And actually, the rationale there, you could kind of argue that it's in defiance of the cult of domesticity, but it's also in conformance with the cult of domesticity. The argument that it violates the cult of domesticity is easy, right? Women aren't supposed to have a political voice in the cult of domesticity. They're supposed to have a voice in the household, not over matters outside the household, which also includes government, right? But on the flip side, if you would argue that it conforms to it, the idea, well, if you've ever been to Wyoming, it's kind of rocky and inhospitable. It's not an easy life, especially out there in the 1860s. It's also the scene of a lot of the Native American wars during that time period. So what happens is that in a lot of these Western states, the environment is kind of similar to Jamestown way back when, where basically men vastly outnumber women. And the cynical argument is that, well, if you don't create families, you kind of lose your tax base if you're a state government. And so you need to basically encourage families to form if you want to, have a stable, local economy, that kind of thing. So basically, for women who moved out to Wyoming, they would receive the right to vote. So you could kind of argue that the idea is that because women are having to, probably work jobs similar to the jobs worked by men in such an inhospitable climate, that there should be an exception for them. So again, we kind of see that weird legacy where some advancement for women is in spite of the cult of domesticity, but you can always make an argument that a lot of these advances are in, conformance with the cult of domesticity. But again, you can kind of see that there's this push for female suffrage in a few of the Western states, but slowly but surely the idea begins to spread. The issue, though, is that remember that the 19th Amendment is ratified in 1920, which means that if you look at the map, especially if you look at the western states, I haven't counted, but it looks like at the very least about half of all states have ratified or accepted some form of, of voting rights for women before the 19th Amendment is ratified. The issue is there's no baseline. So for some states, in some states, women can vote, and in some states, they can't. Also, by the way, in an American history first, the first female presidential candidate runs in the year 1872, and her name is Victoria Woodhull, and her running mate is Civil War abolitionist Frederick Douglass. So we can start to see some significant advances in the post-Civil War environment for women. If you're expecting like a night and day difference, you're going to be disappointed. But we do see women play a very strong role in progressive reform. And once again, it's sometimes it's in conflict with the cult of domesticity, sometimes it's in conformance, sometimes it's both. Maybe a good example of that is Jane Addams in Hull House. So on the radical side, Jane Addams eventually, as her public profile increases, becomes a leading campaigner in the American anti-imperialism movement. When basically America goes out and forms an overseas empire in Cuba and the Philippines, she's somebody who campaigns and protests on the basis that she thinks is immoral. She's also a committed pacifist during a time where jingoism and militarism was kind of a thing around the world. She was also a Christian socialist and a lesbian. So, in other words, for the context, she was seen as somebody who very much did not conform to the cult of domesticity. On the flip side, however, Jane Addams is somebody who is known for Hull House, which was located in Chicago. Chicago was a major sort of hub for immigrants, especially Eastern European immigrants from Poland, from Russia. And so basically she sets up a settlement house that offers classes in history and art, but also practical skills as well. She's, kind of seen first and foremost as an educator. In other words, as a nurturer, which I guess, anyway, that's a whole other can of worms. But yeah, the whole idea that maybe, does that mean I'm a nurturer? I don't think I'm a very nurturing person. No. But anyway, you can kind of see that for many of these reformers, again, you have that kind of mixed picture there. And of course, Mother Mary Harris Jones. Like, if that name in and of itself doesn't advertise, the cult of domesticity right there, I'm not sure what does. But Mary Harris Jones basically campaigns to end child labor. The idea is that she wants kids to stay in schools rather than kids to basically be put into being forced to work in factories and mines, etc. And during the Theodore Roosevelt administration, which is not too far away, spoiler, she actually leads a children's crusade to the White House to personally petition President Roosevelt to do something about child labor in the U.S. By the way, this crusade was much more successful than the actual historical children's crusade to the Middle East. But anyway, if you want probably the best example of how powerful women could be during this time period, all you need to do is look at Ida Tarbell. We've already mentioned Ida Tarbell before, but that passing reference doesn't do her justice. In fact, I'm not sure that anything can do what Ida Tarbell accomplishes justice. So if you're looking at the late 19th century, Standard Oil is the biggest game in town. In fact, it's probably the biggest game in the world. Remember that it dominates 90% of oil production in the United States and 60% of that in the world. You saw the images of Standard Oil basically being this big octopoidal monster gobbling up different parts of planet Earth. And it's easy to sort of, chalk that up to paranoid delusions, right? But it does reflect the fact that Standard Oil was so big that nobody really knew what to do with it. The Sherman Antitrust Act, which was passed all the way back in 1890, is really meant to put Standard Oil on notice that Congress might actually do something. It might break up Standard Oil if it basically utilizes monopolistic anti-competitive practices, at the rate that it had in the past. But Standard Oil ultimately wasn't touched until Ida Tarbell started writing. Ida Tarbell is a muckraker. She is an investigative journalist, and like all great muckrakers, she is very, let's say, open about where her feelings and sympathies lie. She is the daughter of a refinery owner who was basically forced to sell his refinery, at very, very low cost. And basically, her father dies depressed and penniless. Well, Ida Tarbell gets her revenge by writing a series of articles from 1902 to 1904 called A History of Standard Oil. So basically, as you could probably guess, it wasn't a history that was written in a very admiring tone. And apparently, this leads to Standard Oil eventually being abolished, being busted under the Sherman Antitrust Act. And so basically, Ida Tarbell's pen accomplishes more in just a series of articles than Congress is able to accomplish in decades of debate and legislation. So here is the weird thing about the Gilded Age. On the one hand, we see a story of a journalist who takes down the largest corporation on the planet practically around this time period. But at the same time, even though she controls the fate of corporate America, Ida Tarbell arguably didn't have control over her own reproductive health. Because in the 1870s, actually, in 1873, you have the passage of laws called the Comstock Laws. The Comstock Laws banned any distribution in the United States mail relating to any information on contraception, in other words, birth control, such that it was during the 1870s, and any obscenity. Partially, this is kind of a byproduct of the fact that we're still in the Victorian era, where any public references to sexuality, even just sort of mentioning or inferring that sexual relations can occur without, for let's say, purposes other than reproduction, is still very controversial during this time period. And again, the idea of women using contraception is kind of a challenge to what? If you said this thing, you're right. So it's a challenge to the idea of the cult of domesticity, because if contraception is widely available for women, then therefore, arguably, women don't have to be mothers, and the whole system kind of disintegrates. So not all women wanted to challenge the cult of domesticity, but of course many did. And so the question is, how do you challenge that system? And women sort of came to a variety of different solutions. For Charlotte Perkins, who is the author of Women in Economics, she basically argues that as women become more central to the economy, both as workers and as consumers, then eventually, because money is power, they're going to achieve some level of equality with men. And remember that at the same time, and at the Tuskegee Institute, Booker T. Washington is making this same argument for African Americans, that eventually, because of capitalism and the Second Industrial Revolution, those developments will create opportunities that will allow women to, or African Americans in the case of Washington, to achieve some measure of equality. But at the same time, the question is capitalism going to strike down those laws? It's hard to tell. And so this is where we introduce Margaret Sanger. Margaret Sanger, as probably many of you know, is the founder of Planned Parenthood. But Margaret Sanger basically begins sort of a civil disobedience campaign in defiance of some of these Comstock laws. And of course, these Comstock laws are laws that, just in general, have been on the books for a while, but their enforceability is, well, let's just be honest. Like, the idea of criminalizing distribution of information relating to contraception, well, to Margaret Sanger, that just seemed a little ridiculous. Like, are they really going to enforce this? And so she takes a page out of Henry David Thoreau's playbook, where she distributes information on contraception herself, and basically engineers a way for her to be arrested. And the idea is that in this civil disobedience campaign, you draw attention to the absurdity of the law. And eventually, Sanger is arrested, but is later sort of acquitted. And so this kind of brings that issue into national focus. But it's hard to find a more extreme example of how extreme some of these gender norms can be taken than the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in 1911. Remember that, per Charlotte Perkins, it's a good thing that women are going and working in the labor force. And as you remember, starting with the Lowell Mills, women were hired by factory owners because of the idea that they could be exploited. They could be paid less. We think of these mills as kind of being located on the outskirts of cities, but there were some mills and factories that were located in the center of cities, like New York. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, factory was a textile mill, and apparently the managers of that factory were frustrated because of the fact that some of their female employees were socializing on the job and taking out valuable productive time, not working continuously. And so what would happen is that when managers would step out of the factory, they would basically lock the doors to prevent women from leaving their jobs to, like get a bite to eat or something, or, maybe to run home because, I don't know, there's an emergency. Well, unfortunately, in 1911, there is an emergency, but not at home. It's in the factory. The factory, as textile factories are sometimes want to do, catches on fire. Unfortunately, what happens is as soon as the fire breaks out, a lot of the male middle managers, well, they hightail it out of there, but the doors are still locked and there's nowhere to go. So the remaining employees have to climb to the top of the roof, and it's in the middle of New York City. And faced with two choices, fire or a fall, many people choose the fall, and they jump off the rooftops to their deaths in a very horrific public way. Over 146 people die, and I think about 2/3 of them were women. And this takes place right in the middle of New York City, sort of the media capital of the United States. So it's something that really gains national attention in a way that few other industrial accidents do. Also, the fact that these were young women also kind of galvanized the press. So we kind of see the cult of domesticity kick in, that women have to be protected and nurtured. So you kind of see some of those underlying attitudes as well. But the fact is that this example of how discrimination can lead to such a horrific event is something that certainly helps galvanize the movement for national women's suffrage, which is, of course, achieved by 1920. Now, it's easy to kind of assume that progressivism is all female suffrage, social gospel, and a response to urban poverty. But it's also a response to urban corruption, specifically corruption within the political machines that covered urban America during this time period. Now, a lot of people assumed then, and to be honest now, that the politicians of the late 19th century were just abnormally corrupt, and they corrupted everything. And so the reason that we see scandals like the credit mobilier scandal, this sort of example of collusion between congressional representatives, senators, and railroad companies, is because of corrupt and crooked politicians, not so much corrupt and crooked businessmen. Lincoln Steffens argues, though, in his book, The Shame of the Cities, that the issue isn't corrupt politicians. The issue is that business itself is a corrupting influence. Hear his words. I don't know what Lincoln Steffens sounds like. I'm going to pick a voice. In all the cities, the better classes, the businessmen, are the sources of corruption. The shame of the cities, but they are so rarely pursued and caught that we do not fully realize whence the trouble comes. What Steffens argues is that basically the Gilded Age, this time period, is really about the blurring of the lines between business leaders and politicians. Quote, the average American deplores our politics and lauds our businesses. And so, in some respects, he's referring to the fact that many of the robber barons were kind of treated as superstars by Americans. They were kind of celebrity figures. But as he writes, this impulse ignores what business is all about, generating profits. It is folly to expect businessmen to look after any interest broader than their own. So what Steffens is kind of arguing is as the robber barons grow and become wealthier and more powerful, they're naturally going to have a corrupting influence on government. So it's really, and by the way, he has some really unkind things to say about the party bosses. And I think he might mention that in the excerpt of The Shame of the Cities that I asked you guys to read. But Steffens's work brings into focus all the sketchy stuff that's been going on in the cities that we've talked a lot about already. Now, starting around the 1890s, there's a new generation of politicians who kind of agree with Steffens's conclusion. Politicians who sort of run for office as young, doughy-eyed, idealistic public servants of the future, and they're sort of horrified by what they experience. Probably the most noteworthy one, at least before we get to the presidency of Theodore Roosevelt, is a politician from Wisconsin by the name of Robert La Follette. And of course, I love the name that he's better known by, which is Fighting Bob La Follette. And also, that hair is amazing. He's got a nice little pompadour there. But anyway, not only was his hair epic, he also has an epic political career. He basically serves as a congressional representative, senator, and governor from Wisconsin, and basically kind of eventually controls the state because he's been around so long and he's so influential. But La Follette starts off as a young, I think, congressional representative, and he is basically, somebody attempts to bribe him. And that attempted bribe is so that he can influence his brother-in-law, who is a judge. And apparently this just horrifies him, that something like this has happened. But, on the other hand, as you guys will know, this is just kind of like, par for the course during the Gilded Age. So as La Follette's career sort of picks up, he starts to implement a number of changes in Wisconsin. And at this point, you're like, that's great, Mr. Dry, but this is not AP Wisconsinian history. This is AP US history, so get to the point. Well, I will. Because the reforms that we see in Wisconsin are eventually adopted at the national level. And they're things that we kind of take for granted, by the way. So, for example, Wisconsin experiments with open primaries as opposed to the caucus system for selecting candidates. Under the caucus system, you might have candidates selected based upon the input of maybe just party leaders, which, by the way, doesn't sound all that democratic, does it? So the idea is that if you allow for open primaries in which the people can actually nominate the candidates that are going to run for public office, that sort of increases the democratic voice of the people. Um, Now, a couple of other things also kind of happen. You also see La Follette push for a progressive income tax, the implementation of a corporate tax. And by the way, Wisconsin is the first state to create an income tax. Now, of course, what happens is that the national income tax will eventually be adopted by the 16th Amendment and passed in the year 1913. But Wisconsin is the state that sort of leads the way there. But if you remember, that's just the tip of the iceberg because if you're Boss Tweed, democracy's your friend, especially if you get to your supporters use their democratic voice much more than the other parties. So that doesn't quite deal with the issue of corruption. So what La Follette does is he kind of goes after the patronage system. Remember that with the patronage system, you have people who are appointed to positions not because of their knowledge or experience, but because they're well connected. And that's kind of the perk, right? You basically support politicians running for office because of the idea that they'll eventually hire you to do something, even if it's totally out of your depth. So what La Follette does is he actually starts doing something that we kind of take for granted today. He creates these non-governmental commissions and organizations that are designed to, explore possible new legislation. If you guys have ever heard of think tanks, which are these kind of organizations where you have people doing studies and writing and advocating government and politicians to adopt certain policies. La Follette is somebody who really encourages the development of those things. He forms a partnership with the University of Wisconsin and basically allows for academics to kind of have a say in drafting legislation. As you can tell, a lot of academics probably have a favorable opinion of Robert La Follette, and that might be explained by some bias there. But the idea, of course, is to make government more accountable, the government more professional. Something that allows for government to sort of get out from under the thumb of these political machines. And so, by the way, one of the things we kind of see during this time period is the creation of professional police forces. That as cities become more complicated, by the way, instead of cities being run by elected mayors who might not know the first thing about sewage disposal or how to literally make the trains run on time in a place like Chicago, what we see is very often cities develop systems in which the mayor is a ceremonial figure, and instead you have a professional city manager, somebody who's just supposed to know how to, administer things. And all this is kind of a consequence of the progressive era and the efforts of reformers like Robert La Follette. But maybe the most dramatic change of all is the emergence of something from someplace you don't expect, someplace down under, the Australian ballot. The Australian ballot actually doesn't have much to do with Australia, unfortunately. We had the Wisconsin moment in the course. We had the Australian moment in the course. The Australian ballot is a reference to anonymous voting. If you look at voting during really before the 20th century, voting was a highly public affair. And I don't just mean that you had to go to a polling booth and present yourself and prove that you were who you said you were. Voting was something where, like, if you wanted to look over your neighbor's ballot and check that out, you totally could. There was no real privacy there. And in fact, not just that, voting ballots weren't really all that standardized in a lot of municipalities. In fact, what wasn't uncommon is for newspapers to endorse a particular party's candidate, and in a newspaper they would basically print pre-printed ballots, where if you were a good Republican, and why shouldn't you be, you would get a list of all the Republican candidates that you should vote for, and all you would have to do is just drop them in the ballot box. Now, also, by the way, it's not just newspapers that would do this. Employers would sometimes do this, where every employee was given kind of a standardized ballot to take with them to the polling booth. Not saying that your job is on the line, but your job might be on the line. And this was used most famously during the election of 1896, in which many corporate leaders and industrialists basically said that if William Jennings Bryan wins the election, that layoffs would ensue. And so this gave employers a lot more leverage. And so the emergence of anonymous balloting, using standardized ballots, was a very important development to minimize the power and influence of businesses. So starting in the 1890s, voting goes from looking something like this to something that we kind of more or less recognize today. Something that's more difficult for Boss Tweed to kind of directly interfere with, I suppose. Now, a couple other points, and then we will sort of wrap up progressivism until we get to the presidency of Theodore Roosevelt. You also see this growing appetite and desire for social and political change, even in institutions that really aren't supposed to advocate all that much. You see the emergence of a philosophy called legal realism. Legal realism, which is promoted by a future justice of the Supreme Court, Oliver Wendell Holmes, basically takes issue with some of the stuff that we've seen with the Gilded Age. Remember that in the Gilded Age, it wasn't uncommon for corporations to make their workers sign yellow dog contracts where they would promise not to strike. It wasn't uncommon for workers to sign non-compete clauses, which would prevent them from working with for competitors. And basically, corporations had all the bargaining power in the relationship. And so, kind of as a reaction to that, legal realism is a philosophy, which was kind of controversial then and now, which said that, occasionally judges shouldn't just be, referees. They shouldn't just look at a contract or a law and interpret the plain meaning, because sometimes that result isn't fair. Yellow dog contracts are, at least if you read them, are perfectly fair. You could argue that a worker knew what they were getting into. They signed the thing. But remember that the bargaining power isn't the same. And so you see this urge to question some of the, let's say, the legal precedents and laws that sort of favor these big corporations. So one thing that starts to happen is that in the 1880s and 1890s, the Supreme Court resumes its role as being kind of like an agent of change, which doesn't happen consistently throughout U.S. history, but it does happen. So, for example, we have the court case of Mueller versus Oregon, in which it establishes that there is a 10-hour workday for women, basically limiting the extent to which employers can make women work. So beyond that, though, we also see the emergence of, this is probably not going to come as any surprise to many of you, the Socialist Party. And a related development is the emergence of the Industrial Workers of the World, which is a labor union, by the way, that advocates for radical social change. I think I have you read their constitution in one of the primary source documents. But the American Socialist Party is headed by Eugene V. Debs, which who you might remember was featured in I don't think it was the Haymarket strike. It was the Pullman strike. That's right. He helps organize that. Eugene V. Debs is, I think he's from the state of, actually, I don't, I think he's from the state of Indiana, but I might be mistaken there. But he leads the Socialist Party into several presidential elections, and let's just say that he doesn't win, but he doesn't do as badly as you might expect because spoiler, what makes the Socialist Party and socialism so controversial in the United States isn't really socialism per se, at least for a lot of people. Instead, it's the association of socialists with one, the Soviet Union later on, but also immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe. Um, at this point, this socialist movement is entirely homegrown. And so, if you look at in the year 1912, the Socialist Party actually manages to elect 1,200 elected officials across the country. Now, I mean, this ranges from local mayors to dog catchers, right? So it's we're not kind of like assessing the power of these officials, but at the very least, the Socialist Party wasn't kind of associated with being the party of a hostile foreign country, the way it would be starting around excuse me the 1920s. So that gives you an idea for this atmosphere of change that runs through the 1890s and 19 teens. But sometimes you don't just need change from below, you also need change that comes from above. And we'll sort of conclude our discussion of the progressive movement with the presidency of that damned cowboy, Theodore Roosevelt. Till next time.